I'm just Paul. Usually where I live, we have an academic 15 minutes. We know that academics never come on time. And 9 o'clock usually means you wait until 9:15 because you know that the academics will not be coming on time. So we're starting a little bit early because it's not yet 9:15, 10:15. First, thank you very much for inviting me. What Elena also didn't mention is that I also am a visiting professor here at the WOC. And I'm busy with the people from the eLearn Center to set up that center, the policy documents, the research, also as a supervisor for PhD students. And from what I gathered, I'll also have a meeting with 3 students this afternoon. I myself am a cognitive psychologist. So I'm not an educational scientist in the sense of doing research on schools and school systems and things like that. I have a very classical background in psychology, in methodology. I also come originally from the natural sciences. I used to be a teacher of chemistry and biology and mathematics. So I have a very strong background in what I would call doing real research, okay? As opposed to what I often see in education as not being, in my eyes, real hard research. And as a professor of psychology and lifelong learning, and in a prior job as a professor of educational sciences, I was constantly confronted with a lot of people saying a lot of things about education and learning and teaching. And when I looked at the research about it, I found that there wasn't very much research done on it. And the research that was done wasn't very good research, in my opinion. So I kind of got very, very mad about it, and I looked at it and I found that they were urban legends and not real research on learning. So what I will be presenting here is 4 things that you often hear a lot of people talking about with respect to learning and teaching. And I will present research about that, and we'll try to get you to be a little bit more critical about what you hear and what you see and what you do. The things that I say aren't always the most popular things. And I have no problem if anyone wants to interrupt me and ask me about it. We have 2 hours now in this seminar. So, I mean, I can talk for 2 hours, but I can also talk and answer and discuss with you for 2 hours, okay? So please, seriously, if you don't understand something, or if you don't agree, or if you have any questions about it, just ask. Okay? Otherwise, I'm just going to talk. I think many of you people have seen in some form what's called the learning pyramid. At the moment, there are a lot of people making web quests. And if you look at what they're writing about it, they often base what they're doing. Hello, please come in. Great. They often base what they're doing on this learning pyramid idea. And the idea behind it is kind of, it's almost Zen. You know, Zen, if I give you a fish, you will eat for a day. If I teach you to fish, you will eat for your lifetime. It's the idea of what I hear, I forget. What I see, I remember, and what I do, I understand. This whole idea of learning by doing. And a lot of it is based upon that, and you see different parts of it here, like from a lecture, you will remember 5%. I can't read it because of the thing. If it's audiovisual, it will be 20%. If it's a demonstration, it will be 30%. If you discuss it in a group, it will be 50%. And it sounds really, really good. And we see a lot of the education that we're making at the moment based upon this idea. It's not only based upon this idea, but when I went to the website, I found on the internet, I found almost 10,000 websites that make use of learning pyramid. And if you just Google Bales and learning and pyramid, you get like 30, 40,000 hits of people making use of this. And I wanted to find out, is this true? And so I did some research on it. And I went to the National Training Laboratory, because if you look at this, you find that often this Bales learning pyramid from either 1954 or 1969 is based upon research supposedly done at the National Training Laboratory. And what they say there, and this is a direct quote, is we believe it to be accurate, but no, we no longer have any, nor can we find any research that supports this. So in other words, everybody is citing Bales' learning pyramid, Maslow's learning pyramid from 1954 or 1969 based upon this cone of experience, but there's absolutely no empirical data to support any of this. The pyramid pleases, as I say at the bottom, because it supports what we would like to believe as being the truth. And we're making education based upon something we believe and not something that we know. And that's the major problem. I've looked in the Netherlands at different sites, and I find that our Knowledge Network, which is a government organization for use of information and communication technologies in education, gives it, that's that red thing here up, their seal of approval. This is KennisNet, ICT in school, Knowledge Network, ICT in school, government-supported organization that says this is what we should use, but we have no proof of it. The educational wiki of the largest teacher training university in the Netherlands has it on their education wiki, although there's no empirical support of it. Even the inaugural address of a professor of quality improvement in the veterinary sciences for animal medicine says that he will improve the education in his area based upon this, which means we will no longer teach, we will let people do. There's a, I have here, every once in a while I stand up and move to different places. I have found a newsletter of one of the other schools of education in the Netherlands that decided to do an empirical proof of this and to find out whether or not it really is true that if you only teach and explain to someone else, they will only remember 5%, and if you let them read it, it will be 10% and things like that. And the numbers that they got were completely different, and they said here that it's a complete fake. And most of the research that you do finds out it's a complete fake, and the numbers can't actually work. And some of the things that you say include other things. I mean, a discussion group will normally have someone also teaching, and so it's kind of a very strange thing, but we're doing a lot of things based upon it. And in English, this is called an urban legend. And the definition of an urban legend, of legenda urbana, is a widely circulated story, often believed to be true by the teller, but usually distorted, exaggerated, or fabricated for effect, and often for humor or horror. And it goes like this. One tells the other person, my brother-in-law knows someone who, and you get stories like the alligator in the sewer. I was born in New York City, and we always heard stories about some child got an alligator as a birthday present, and the mother flushed it down the toilet, and these sewer people were working on it, and they were attacked by a 5-meter-long alligator in the sewer. Yeah? Or you have the woman with the high hairdo with all types of lacquer in it, and she was found dead. She was bit to death by spiders that were living in her hair. And it's always, yeah, I saw it, somebody saw it in a newspaper, but they can never find the real proof of it. There are books about urban legends called, one of them is a really good book, it's called The Vanishing Hitchhiker. It's the hitchhiker that went and was picked up and never returned, or whose hand was found, and all of those types of things. There have been really urban sociological research done on it, and the thing is, it always sounds very, very good, and you want to believe it. It fits in your way of thinking, but in an urban legend, there's never any proof. And what I will be talking about is proof. I think the last example, really good example of an urban legend, was Colin Powell and his weapons of mass destruction, which also turned out to be an urban legend, but led to a United Nations resolution and the United States, followed by a number of countries, I think Spain also, in any event the Netherlands, supporting the invasion of Iraq, based upon this urban legend that there were weapons of mass destruction there. So you can see, I mean, I can make fun of it, but these urban legends can really have a destructive effect. And my problem is these types of urban legends lead to armies invading and killing people, and urban legends in education often lead us to bad education. And if we think that children and the people we educate are the future of our country, or the future of Europe, or even the future of the world, I don't think that we should be basing our education on urban legends. I think we should be basing it on good psychological and educational research. Okay? So that's what I'll be trying to deal with. And this is the problem. I don't usually read my slides. I learned from good educational research, from psychological research, John Sweller, on cognitive load. He presented a position on PowerPoint, and he called PowerPoint no damn power, no damn point. It's because people tend to write these great things and also read it, and that leads to an increase in cognitive load in which you don't, it's called the redundancy principle, and you don't, if you read exactly what you say, you don't have the cognitive capacity, I'll talk about that later, to really do it. And also, I tend to read in a different speed than you, speak in a different speed than you read, so you get this conflict, this dissonance. So this is it. And this preconceptual science is, first you reach a conclusion, and then you look for facts that support it, and then you throw away anything that doesn't support it. It's kind of like a religion. Okay? And this is Wiley Miller, who talks about it. It's one of my favorites. But what I try to do is to base my ideas about how to make learning environments, how to design texts, instructional design. I try to base it on science. And what is science based upon? If you go to the old science, it's Francis Bacon. And Francis Bacon says you gather a lot of data, you look at the data, and from all the data that you have, you try to find patterns in it, and you make a hypothesis. Other scientists go through thought experiments. I mean, Albert Einstein, in his relativity theory, it was based upon a thought experiment, not on data. And also, so it can be inductive and deductive, it doesn't matter. But you assume something, and based upon what you assume, you come up with a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is something that can be either verified or falsified. It's very, very simple. And what you do then is you set up an experiment or a situation in which you can test that. And if you test it, if you don't find results that contradict your hypothesis, you tend to get the idea, hey, my hypothesis can be true. And if you find things that don't agree with it or that falsify it, you either throw away your hypothesis or you change your hypothesis to say, well, okay, well, maybe I wasn't right in the first case, but. And a typical example of that is evolution theory. It is still a theory. It will always be a theory, because if you look at it in the Popper sense of Karl Popper, you can only falsify, so you're constantly looking for things which disprove it, and as long as you don't find anything disproving it, you say, okay, I will accept it as a theory, and I will deal with it in that way. And at this moment, we still have all of these types of information saying that evolution is something that can explain why we are the way we are. I'll get into that in a couple of minutes. So you accept it, and at the end of it, if it's not the case that your research proves it, under well-controlled situation, you reject it if it doesn't come out. That's completely different from a belief. In Dutch, we have the saying, you believe in the church. Yeah? I have nothing against religion, but religion is based upon belief. Things that we cannot prove. If we try to prove it, we come into problems. And it's, as it says here, it's something that we have not accepted or rejected based upon any type of proof. And you have this trust that it will be the case. And it usually goes through 3 stages in my, from my experience. It's first you see something and you immediately draw a conclusion. Yeah? Based upon that, you continue to have that even if it's been proven wrong. You'll find reasons to say why it wasn't the case. And after that, you tend to then denounce other people for not having that belief, that you excommunicate them from the church or from the church of thought. It doesn't have to be religion. I mean, a very good example is paranormal things. James Randi is a magician. You know, he's kind of like, he goes to Las Vegas and he pulls rabbits out of hats and things behind your ear, or he can tell you what you're thinking. And he says, I am a magician. I'm there to trick you. Yeah? And I won't tell you how I tricked you, but I will tell you I have no special powers. And he put a check from a bank for $10,000 up to anyone who could prove that they could Uri Geller bend a spoon based upon paranormal things, if they could do it in a way that would stand up to a good, controlled piece of research. That $10,000 has never been given out yet. And if you do it in a controlled situation, then you hear things like, well, the vibrations in the room were wrong, so it didn't work. Okay? Now, sorry, but the vibrations, you can all not believe that gravity exists and give any vibrations you want, but if I let go of this, it will fall to the table. You don't have to believe in something to have it exist. You don't have to have good karma or good vibrations. So this idea of a belief is you first say that it's the case. You then, even after it hasn't proven to be the thing, you say, well, it's because you didn't believe your vibrations were bad, and eventually you say, you are a non-believer. And we've seen it in a lot of things. I mean, I will not step on all of your toes, but homeopathy, yeah? there was a piece of research in Science magazine, which then got a lot of, Science magazine got a lot of very bad letters about it. Because they spoke of water with a memory. Because what they did is they said, well, this is a solution that you dilute and dilute and dilute and dilute to 10 to the 6th power. That's more than 1,000,000 times, okay? Which means that in 1,000,000 gallons or liters of this, there will be 1 molecule of a substance. That means if you put that all in these small bottles, that means the chance of that 1 molecule of substance being in that water is virtually 0. So what the parapsychologists came up with, water has a memory. Although the molecule isn't in that bottle of water remembers that the molecule used to be here and will still have the same working. Because of this, I don't know if it's the case here, it is the case in America, it is the case in the Netherlands. What we see is a lot of innovation based upon belief, something that sounds good. We see it implemented all over without any proof that it's going to work. When it's implemented, we don't have very much research, good research, on when and why it works, or when and why it doesn't work. We often see them using the term, actually, evidence-based. That second thing that I wrote there, large-scale implementations without proof, which is not the same as evidence-based, I'll get into in a second. What we see is poor education, people who become very dissatisfied. In the Netherlands, you have one group of people who says, you shouldn't do anything, you shouldn't teach anything. Let the student discover everything themselves. We don't even have a curriculum. And you have other people who said the only good education is standing in front of the class and going like this. And so you get this kind of like holy war between the behaviorists and the constructivists that tend to hate each other. About this evidence-based, that's the newest, one of the newest hypes in any event in the Netherlands. It's come from the United States, Bush in 2001, No Child Left Behind. And I don't know if you know very much about evidence-based, but I also wrote an article on that. Evidence-based is a way of doing research either in medicine or in pharmacy to make a drug. I won't go deeply into it, but what they did is they say the methodology that you use for evidence-based, you should also use in education. Now, there are a couple of problems with that. Number one is just the fact that it really doesn't matter if I'm in the train or in my work or wherever if I take my drug in the trial, as long as it's an hour after having breakfast. Anyone who's been involved in education and taught children knows that if I do in the second class of the day the exact same thing I did in the first class of the day, chances are something different is going to happen. So the idea that you can actually control it, yeah, is a little bit strange. So the whole methodology of evidence-based is based upon the idea that you can control the situation, that you can give a placebo, that certain things don't really matter. So that's a problem in itself. But if you look at what the drug industry does to make evidence-based, they say, well, the time period between having an idea and having the drug on the market, and let's say having the idea and implementing it in education, for the drug company is approximately 20 years. So they've done 20 years of research. For every new medicine that's brought on the market, there's almost $400 million invested in research. $400 million. 300 million euros for each new medicine. Think of what that would mean for each new educational innovation if you were given 300 million euros to do good research on it, to implement it. 12 to 20 years. And in medicine, and they want you to use this methodology, this idea of evidence-based. In medicine, of every 1,000 ideas, 995 never even reach the phase of testing with people. That's called phase 2, clinical trials. 995. 99.5% of all ideas in pharmacy and medicine are thrown away before they even test it on a small group of people. And of those 5 things that are tested, only 1 ever reaches the market. So they throw away 999 ideas for that 1 drug. And of all of the budget of a drug company, 25% is for research and development. If you translate that to the Catalonian government or the Spanish government, is 25% of all of the budget for education in Spain or Catalonia for research? In the Netherlands, it is, what do I have here? It is 1 promille, 0.1% of all of the money given for education is for research and development, as opposed to 25% in the drug company. So think about it the next time someone says to you, we should do it evidence-based. I'll go a little bit more quickly. What I'm going to discuss now are 4 claims. Okay? These are the 4 claims, and by each of the claims, I will be asking 4 questions, a question. The first one is based upon the idea that old learning is bad and out of date. We have these new learners who are capable of multitasking. So I'm going to discuss the literature and research on that idea about multitasking. The second is based upon the idea that the information society demands another type of learning. The third is that learning today for children of today is boring. So we have to make it like MTV. And the fourth one is that we have this articulate society, people who have their own ideas, and we should put the locus of control by the learner instead of the teacher. We shouldn't know best as educators. I'm going to go through these things. And the first thing I'm going to ask is, can children actually multitask? And I'm going to discuss this from an evolutionary point of view and from a cognitive point of view. Okay? First, what is multitasking? We have to define things properly. Multitasking is that you are capable of carrying out 2 separate thinking processes at the same time. Okay? I'm not talking about automated processes, things that you can do without thinking. So what we're talking about is chatting and at the same time reading or doing your algebra homework. Okay? What we're even talking about is, you could say walking and talking at the same time. You have the joke in English, walking, he's so stupid he can't walk and chew gum at the same time. Yeah? Type of thing. You can say, well, walking is, you can do that, you can walk and talk at the same time, but often if you're really deep in thought while you're talking to someone and walking down the street, you'll step off of the curb and not see it and maybe fall or stumble. You might walk into something or a person, those types of things. So even something as automated as walking down the street, there are conscious thought processes that are necessary so that you don't end up in front of a car or fall off the curb or walk into a pole. And I'm going to first deal with this idea of multitasking, as I said, from an evolutionary point of view. Okay? And I'm going to do that by analogy. That's a typical thing that you do in science. I'm going to talk about our metabolism, about how we work with food that we've eaten. If you go to the United States, this is normal. Okay? Unfortunately. And you can ask, why is this normal? And the reason is evolutionary. When we first started, and we can even go back to apes, but let's say the Homo sapien, the human being as we know it now. We always had these periods of time when there was no food, that's called winter, and periods of time where there was a lot of food, and that was usually summer and fall. So you had these periods of a lot of food and times of little food. And that meant you had to develop, no, sorry, I say it wrong because it sounds as if evolution is deterministic, and it isn't. What happened was, our body tried to store the excess of food that we had so that we could live through the periods that there wasn't any food. I was a biology teacher, okay? Fat, 1 gram of fat delivers more than 9 kilocalories of energy. 1 gram of carbohydrate, of protein, has 4 kilocalories. That means every gram of fat I have has twice as much energy as every gram of carbohydrate or protein. What that meant is, if my body is capable of storing all that excess food as fat, I will have more energy for every gram of fat that is stored than for every gram of carbohydrates. Very, very simple. That means that people, beings, beasts, whatever you want to call it, who were capable of storing that excess as fat, they would probably live through the winter and spring until the summer came and there was more food. And those that didn't have that would die. And that means over a period of generations, you'd get the gene pool would have more and more and more of these people, human beings, that were capable of storing energy as fat, and less that were capable of storing it as carbohydrates and proteins. Which means a simple mutation of being able to store more fat meant that you would live longer. You'd live long enough to have offspring, and those offspring would probably have that same gene for storing fat. Very simple. That's the way evolution works. It doesn't say we need a gene for this. That means you live if you have that mutation, and that mutation is brought further in the gene pool if it has a function. And the only function in evolution is having children, having offspring. That's the only thing. Living long enough to have offspring and having them. That's the reason why women have more fat than men. I mean, it's so simple. That's why women have hips, yeah, which are there to store fat, because they not only have to live through the winter, but if they have offspring, they have to have enough energy also to feed the offspring. So they need more fat than men. Men have 9 to 12%. Women have 19 to 22% fat on their body. That's normal. That's why women look like that and men look like this, or should look like this, and women should look like that. Okay? It has an evolutionary reason. Because if you as a woman don't have these hips to store the fat, if you didn't have these hips to store the fat on your body, that means you probably wouldn't live long enough first to have a child. And if you had the child, either you or the child would die because you didn't have enough fat on your body to nurture that child. It's that simple. I mean, it's really not rocket science. Evolution is really dumb mutation. A mutation that will make sure that you live longer and have more offspring is beneficial and will be gone. As soon as it isn't beneficial anymore, it will die out. I mean, you have these birds that live certain places, and all of a sudden the water starts to dry up and dry up. It doesn't happen from one day to the other, and they get longer and longer beaks. They don't get it because of some deterministic thing, but the bird that had a longer beak could find something to eat in the mud, and the one that didn't have the longer beak would drown and die and wouldn't get anything to eat. It's that simple. And all of a sudden it's completely dried up and their beak is so long that they can't fly anymore. And then they die out because it doesn't have an evolutionary function anymore. It's just that simple. And that's what should happen to people, because we have no scarcity anymore. Since the Industrial Revolution and trains and boats and planes, we can bring things from warmer places to colder places, and you can have food all year long. And we learned how to preserve foods and things like that. So we really don't need it. But our body in 8 or 9 or 10 generations hasn't changed at all. So we get fat. It's that simple. And if we didn't have any medicine, if there wasn't any medical science, what would probably happen is that this would die off. People who were overtly obese, children now at the age of 8, 9 have diabetes. If there wasn't any insulin, they would die. And they wouldn't have more babies. They wouldn't have babies. And people who didn't get diabetes and lived longer, they would get heart attacks and things like that. And that would die out in the population, and the advantage of having fat wouldn't be an advantage anymore. It would be a cost, an evolutionary cost, and they'd die. But we now have medicine, so we can give children who are 5, 6, 7 insulin, so that they will eventually have children who have this gene for excessive fat. Okay. Very simple metabolism. Not very, I mean, it's a part of our body that we take completely for granted. Now let's compare it with the brain. If in 10 generations, again I said it's an analogy, if in 10 generations we haven't reached the point where people are no longer getting fat, but actually they're constantly getting fatter, how can we possibly have the idea that in a half a generation, that the generation Einstein, the internet generation, one of my colleagues calls it the Homo sapiens, how can it be that in a half a generation, the brains of children have evolved to be able to do something that was never possible, multitasking, 2 processes at the same time? So the next time someone says to you, children can multitask, you don't have to believe me. But just think about it and ask yourself, can that happen? It's taken us 4 million years to have a cranium, where our brains are in, that have evolved into Homo sapiens. 4 million years. Can we really change our brains in a half a generation? Is it really so that children nowadays are so different than we were when we were children because they can multitask? I tend to think that that's not the case, based upon evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology. But we can look at it from another point of view, from cognitive science. As I said, cognitively speaking, we can only multitask that which is automated and where thinking doesn't play a role. I'll give you 2 citations. The National Academy of Sciences, I mean, that's the highest body of research, says that multitask behavior leads to poor learning results. If you try to do 2 things at once that require thought, or if you have to switch quickly, because that's the other thing, you can say, okay, they don't multitask, they switch. So they switch back and forth very quickly. We do that also. It's not something that just kids do. Between 2 or more tasks that require thought, then you make more mistakes and it takes twice as long as compared to sequential work. You make more mistakes and it takes twice as long. In a recent piece of research on reading comprehension and internet messaging, chat, they found that that is indeed the case. Children who were reading and then internet messaging took almost twice as long to reach the same comprehension level as if they were doing the 2 things at the same time. So you can reach the same comprehension level eventually, but it takes twice as long. And there it was 8 minutes and 14 minutes. And you can say, okay, that's not very much. But I mean, think about it in your own situation where you often have to read an article that takes 2 or 3 hours to learn and comprehend it and understand it. And then it takes 5 or 6 hours. And the question is, do you have that time to do that? And do you want to do that in an educational situation? Dave Meyer, who's the director of Brain Cognition and Action Lab at Michigan State, said the following. If a teenager is trying to have a conversation on an email chat line while doing algebra, she will suffer a decrease in efficiency compared to if she just thought about algebra until she was done. People may think otherwise, but it's a myth. With such complicated tasks, you will never, ever be able to overcome the inherent limitations in the brain for processing information when multitasking. So, I mean, it sounds very, very good, but I don't know if you've ever done that, but I'm sitting and talking to someone and have a meeting, and I always have my computer on. And in the corner of my eye, I see that an email has come. And while I'm talking to someone, I try to kind of look and see what the email says, and I'm reading it. And at that point in time, I don't hear the person anymore. And they'll say something, and I mean, I'm doing something as simple as I'm sitting with a person. There's no other person talking to me. And I'm not capable of reading in part of an email message and listening at the same time. Okay? So, but what does cognitive science say? And I'm going to do a little test with you. Okay? A little psychological test. I want you to look at the next slide and try to name the colors of the words. Okay? Not read the words, just the colors of the words. Okay? Yeah, no problem? I mean, left to right, right to left, it doesn't matter. Blauw, vert, vermel, violetta, negre. No problem. Huh? Now I want you to, in your head, name the colors of the blocks. Unfortunately, we have this light and it's projected, but also no problem, I think. Blauw, vert, vermel. No problem. I want you to now, in the next slide, tell me, or in your head, the colors of the words. Now, unless you are a bunch of geniuses or people from another planet, since 1935, we know that you had problems doing this, that it took longer and you made more mistakes because sometimes you read the word and then you thought, oh no, I have to say the color of the word and not read the word. So what I'm asking you to do is something very simple. You probably learned the colors when you were 2 years old, 3 years old. Your mother stood there and said, blauw. And you said, blauw. And probably when you were 5 or 6 years old, you went to primary school and you had a teacher who stood there and taught you the letters, and you learn to read those words because they're not really hard words to read. And the only thing I asked you to do was to multitask. Something that you know since, I didn't ask you to understand the relativity theory of Einstein or to solve some type of incredible algebraic equation. I asked you to just tell me the color of a word. Okay? And you probably weren't able to do that. That's called the Stroop test. Since 1935, so for 73 years, 74 years, we know that people can't do that. Yet we have educators saying that children can now multitask. But we'll even go further. There's a piece of research, a bunch of research done and in one of the best journals that there is on these topics. It's called Human Factors in Ergonomics. Of talking on the cell phone and driving drunk. Okay? Those are the three things. This is here, driving drunk. This is the baseline. And this is using a cell phone. And we're talking about using a cell phone either like this or hands-free. It doesn't matter. And they did it in a very controlled situation, and they found, for example, that cell phone drivers had 3 accidents, while the baseline and the people who were drunk, legally drunk, had no accidents. That the time to brake for people who were drunk and people who were just driving was approximately the same, but cell phone users had considerably more time needed to be able to brake. That the amount of time after braking to get up to normal speed again was longer for these people. And not only that, they also found that the people, if you look here, that even self-driving were direct to gaze when they were told to look at objects in the environment while they were driving in the simulator, failed to see them when they were talking on the cell phone. So that means they didn't see things happening. People stepping out from cars, school buses stopping. That, in other words, you could better drive drunk than drive using a cell phone. While we're thinking driving is fairly automatic. We've all learned it. Those weren't people who had just learned to drive, those were experienced drivers. And it wasn't something new using a cell phone for them. They were experienced at using the cell phone. And the people who were drunk were legally drunk, and they tested the blood alcohol. In other words, something as simple as driving a car and talking to someone else on a cell phone is something you cannot do. And doesn't matter compared to handheld and hands-free, identical. So this idea, it's because you have it in your hand, has nothing to do with it. Yeah?
I think the problem is that we tend to think, or we think that we can do that.
Yeah.
And you're saying that we can't,
Yeah.
based on evidence. But
Yeah. We tend to think, yeah.
I see the problem that we think that we can.
Exactly, and that's why what I also said with, we tend to think that children can multitask, so we can make education in which we build in the possibility of multitasking, whereas research shows that it is less effective and less efficient. You make more mistakes and it takes longer.
Sorry, what would be the difference between
Sitting in it and talking to someone else who's sitting next to you. There's been a lot of, I'm glad you asked that, I don't have to say it myself. There's been a lot of research. People who are in the car with you at the same time drive with you. They lower their voice in a dangerous situation. They stop talking when it gets even more dangerous, or they make you a tent. People who are talking to you on the telephone don't drive with you. That's the major explanation for why it's the case. It's because of that they tend to drive along with you. And if you say, well, you can listen to a radio, but you're not concentrating. And if you start to concentrate on what's happening on the radio, from who was the composer again of that and when was it, you would see that in times that you're thinking about the music, your driving ability will be less. You possibly won't get into an accident, but you won't see the things happening around you as well as if you're not concentrating on. As soon as it comes from, there's a traffic jam somewhere and you're driving and you have the radio on, and it's we have in the Netherlands, you'll probably also have it here, that as soon as you're in the neighborhood, as soon as a traffic notification comes on the radio, it gets louder, or you're listening to your CD and all of a sudden that comes on and you listen to it, all of a sudden you're not concentrating on the road anymore. You're now listening for where am I going to be in a traffic jam type of thing. So there is a difference.
We are talking about the controlled situation.
Yeah.
But what about the contextual issues? For example, the type of road, the skill the driver has.
Well, it means that the more...
Where is the boundary for a control or evidence-based?
What they did is they had all different types of conditions. So driving on city streets and driving on rural roads and in dangerous situations and in non-dangerous situations. All of them were experienced drivers. And things like that. I mean, it's even worse for an inexperienced driver, because talking about switching, I mean, an experienced driver looks in this mirror, that mirror, checks this, and does all of these things kind of almost automatically, but is doing it. checking all of the things. And if you look at an inexperienced driver, they even have to think about it. Oh yeah, look in my mirror, look at this. They move their heads instead of moving their eyes and things like that. So it's even worse. I mean, if this is with experienced drivers, this type of results, you can imagine what it would be like for an 18-year-old that just got their license and then is driving and talking to their friends at the same time while listening to rap music and whatever. So this is actually the case. I mean, I wouldn't tell anyone to drive drunk, but if I'm going to say which should you do? Drive drunk or talk on the telephone, I'd say drive drunk. In any event, research proves that it's safer.
Personally, you're helping me to change my habits.
Okay.
Because I would never drive while, after.
So now you're going to go drink and go lunch and drive drunk home.
Well, but I'll feel safer when
Yeah.
But I'll never again, because just yesterday I was speaking on my phone while driving.
Yeah, I don't do that ever, even hands-free. I always let it go, and then I stop somewhere and I see who called me and I call them back. And if I'm talking to someone and I hear that they're in the car, I'll say, I'll call you back later when you arrive, or call me when you arrive, because I don't want to talk to you while you're driving. Okay, that's this idea of multitasking. Maybe I've proven to you, there's a whole lot more research on that, but all of the research, there is no research that says that multitasking exists and that doing two things at the same time is better than trying to do two things at the same time is better than doing it sequentially. One after the other, concentrating, always in every piece of research is better. So think about that the next time they say, let's create an environment in which they can multitask, because kids today can multitask. They're these digital natives that can multitask. Okay. The second is discovery learning. That's kind of based upon the Bell's pyramid. Yeah. What I'll first say is discovery learning can exist. If you look at this comic that I found, it says, congratulations, it only took about 65,298 seconds. The thing is, discovery learning is not effective or efficient. And we are normally in an educational situation in which we need to learn or teach a certain amount in a certain time, or we want students to learn a certain thing in a certain time. Okay? That's number one. So before we get into it, he's anti-discovery. He isn't. He's anti-unguided discovery. That's number one. And number two, I'm anti this idea of that discovery is better in all situations, because what we find with a lot of people who are constructivists is that knowledge has to be created and discovered and built up together. And if you listen and read Diana Kuhn, she says domain knowledge doesn't exist. But I'll get into that also a little bit later. So that's number one. Number two, discovery learning can be good depending upon what you want someone to discover. I mean, if I want them to discover what the gravitational constant is, and that's 9.8 meters per second squared, I don't want them to discover it. If I want them to see how hard it is to do science, I might want them to do discovery so that they can see that to get it as exact as 9.8 meters per second squared, it takes quite a lot of time and you make a lot of mistakes and your experimental error is different. So it also depends upon what you want to do. Do you want to have them have this idea of what it means, or do you want them to know or learn something? And I'm going to discuss this first from the viewpoint of our cognitive architecture. You are all researchers, but I don't know if you're cognitive scientists. But for many of you, this will be very, very well known, and you'll fall asleep now. We use, since the 50s and the 60s, from Anderson, this idea of a three-box model of memory. That means things happen all around us, and we have this sensory memory. Yeah, that's our fingers, we hear, we smell. I mean, I don't know if you ever noticed it, but all of a sudden you can be walking somewhere and you smell something and you think of home, or you think of something. Yeah, it's this sensory memory that you have. Yeah, and that sensory memory, it has a very large capacity, but it holds things for a very short period of time. And if you don't think about it, if you don't do something with it, it's gone. It's kind of like, I will now tell you that this is making a sound in the background and can be very annoying. And you probably didn't hear it until that moment, or didn't attend to it. And now that I told you about it, you will attend to it, and your sensory memory, through attention, it will now go into your short-term memory. And the longer I talk about it, and the more I say that it's very, very annoying, if I say that, by the end of this, you will hear this and it will be driving you crazy. Okay? Because you will be rehearsing it, this elaborative rehearsal, and I'll constantly say it to you, so this rote effect, kind of thinking about it every time, not doing very much. So it goes into your short-term memory, and if you don't do anything with it, you lose it within, some people say 2 seconds, other people say 30 seconds. 30 seconds was what Peterson said in 1959. Okay? So we know since 1959, if we don't do anything with it for 30 seconds, we lost it. It might as well never have happened. Okay? And we know that it's also limited. Baddeley says 7 plus or minus 2. Miller said in 1956, 5 plus or minus 2. And remember, we're talking about new pieces of information. Not things we already know. Because things we already know are in elaborative rehearsal. It's in our long-term memory. And that's unlimited. Okay? And unless you get Alzheimer or something with your brain, it's there for the rest of your life. Okay? And it can be interfered with. It can be enriched. We know since Piaget the ideas of assimilation and accommodation. New things that we see that are in accord with our schemas, we assimilate into our schemas, and we make more elaborate and more intricate schemas. And things that happen that don't agree with our schemas, if that happens enough, we will tend to change our schemas. That's called accommodation. Assimileren, accommoderen. Yeah? Jean Piaget. The patron saint of constructivism was a pure cognitive psychologist, developmental psychologist. Okay. What are we talking about now if we're talking about discovery learning? We're talking about people have a problem. They're given a problem that they have to discover something. They have to come across all new types of information. They have to evaluate if that new information is relevant for solving the problem, figure out how it solves the problem. It's not things from their, discovery learning, we're talking about learning, so we're not talking about things they already know. So this limited short-term memory doesn't have enough capacity to deal with the problem, referencing the problem, all of the new things, evaluating whether the new things are actually available. In a second, I'll go into weak and strong problem-solving strategies and things like that. I'm just talking about the cognitive architecture. Our brain can't do that. There's a reason for that. John Sweller and Geary will say that it's an evolutionary reason. The evolutionary reason is, if, I'll put it very simply, John wrote a beautiful chapter on it. But very simply, we don't have an executive function in our head to deal with new information. We only have that executive function if it's old information. A chess player, a grandmaster, doesn't remember a chess piece. That person remembers a whole chess board and a whole chess game as one chunk of information. But if you're in a situation in which all of this information is coming to you at the same time and you have to decide, am I going to run or am I going to fight? If you had an unlimited short-term memory, you would probably be still thinking about what am I going to do at the time that the tiger ate you up. It's that simple. So we have a very limited short-term memory to deal with new information, to make sure that without a central executive function in our brain which governs how we think about and how we work with it, that you don't have too much in your head. You tend to use heuristics. You throw away certain things and you only relate to certain other things to get me out of this situation as quickly as possible or to stay. That's an evolutionary. But our cognitive architecture has evolved and is like this for the past 10,000 years. It's that simple. Discovery you can do, but it's not very effective and not very efficient, and often leads to discovery of the wrong things. Any of you have children know how persistent naive theories can be. In science, we have something called naive theories of science. That's, for example, if I throw a ball, there are still forces working on that ball pushing it ahead. Science tells us there are only two forces working on the ball. One of them is called gravity, and the other is called friction, and they both stop it. 1/3 of all university students still think that there's a force in the natural sciences, a force driving the ball forward once it's left your hand, or driving it isn't. So it's a naive theory. We have this idea that it works, and we know as natural scientists how hard it is to get rid of these. So experience can also mean not only that you learn the right thing, but you learn the wrong thing, and it's kind of hard. Once you've learned the wrong thing, it tends to be very persistent and stay. Yeah?